Mom spent $8,000 to unmask my lies. The PI's second envelope unmasked her $95,000 embezzlement instead. The Sunday my mother hired a private investigator to destroy me was the same Sunday I closed a $4.2 million contract with a regional hospital network in Ohio. I didn't know about the investigator yet. I was sitting in my home office in Charlotte finishing the contract summary when my phone buzzed with a text from my brother Daniel. "Mom's planning something big for Thanksgiving. You should come." That was it. No explanation. No warmth. Just the bait, dangled the way Daniel had been dangling things in front of me since we were children, with that particular smirk embedded in the subtext, the one that said, "I know something you don't and I can't wait to watch you find out." I set my phone face down and kept working. I should explain who I was to my family before I tell you who I actually am. To my mother, Patricia Holloway, I was the disappointment she'd learned to manage. The middle child who hadn't gone to law school like Daniel, hadn't married well like my younger sister Renee, hadn't built her life around the things my mother considered evidence of success. The right neighborhood, the right husband, the visible markers of having arrived somewhere worth arriving. To my father, Gerald, I was simply confusing. A daughter who worked too much, traveled too often and had nothing obvious to show for it. No husband. No children. No house in the suburbs she could point to at church. To Daniel I was a target. I had always been a target. My name is Nadia Holloway. I am 34 years old. I am the founder and controlling shareholder of ClearPath Health Technologies, a healthcare software company based in Charlotte, North Carolina, currently valued at $78 million. We build patient data management platforms for mid-sized hospital networks and surgical centers. We have 41 employees. We have won the NC Tech Association's Emerging Company Award 2 years running, and last spring, I was named to the Southeast Business Journal's list of the 40 most influential executives under 40. My family knew none of this. That was not an accident. I had learned by the time I was 26 that sharing good news with my family was a form of self-harm. It started with small things. A promotion at my first job, mentioned at Easter dinner, met with my mother asking whether the title came with benefits, and Daniel pointing out that his law firm's starting salary was higher. A lease on my first apartment, mentioned proudly, immediately followed by my mother's concern that the neighborhood wasn't safe and her suggestion that I move back home until I had more stability. By the time I started ClearPath in my spare bedroom with $40,000 in savings and a client I'd cold emailed 47 times before he finally said yes, I had stopped sharing anything. It was not resentment that made me quiet. It was strategy. I had watched what happened when my family had information about my life. They used it. They worried it. They picked at it until the confidence I'd built crumbled and I was left second-guessing decisions that had been perfectly sound before they touched them. So I built my company in silence. I took meetings they never knew about. I flew to conferences in cities I never mentioned. I hired my first employee, Marcus Webb, now my VP of Operations and my closest professional ally, on a Tuesday morning and went home for Thanksgiving that Thursday and answered my mother's question about work with, "Things are fine, staying busy," while internally, I was terrified and exhilarated and completely alone with the weight of what I was building. Marcus knew about my family. He had heard enough sideways comments on phone calls I'd taken during long work nights that he'd pieced together the shape of it. He never pressed. He just built the company alongside me with the same quiet, focused energy I was putting in. On the day we crossed $10 million in annual recurring revenue, he brought a bottle of champagne to the office, poured 2 glasses and said, "You know what the best part is? Nobody who doubted you even knows to feel stupid yet." I had laughed harder than I had in years. My closest friend outside work was a woman named Sasha Okafor, who I had met at a leadership conference in Atlanta 4 years earlier. Sasha ran a nonprofit focused on maternal health access in underserved communities. She was brilliant and blunt and constitutionally incapable of telling me what I wanted to hear instead of what I needed to. She was the only person outside my company who knew the full picture of what I had built. "You're going to have to tell them eventually," she said once over dinner in Charlotte. "I know," I said. "Do you want to?" I thought about that for a long time. Not really. I want to be seen without having to perform it for them. I want them to already know somehow without me having to hand it to them and watch them decide what it's worth. Sasha had looked at me with the specific expression she reserved for moments when she thought I was both completely right and completely impractical. "That's not how families work, Nadia." "No," I agreed. "It's not. The Thanksgiving gathering was at my parents' house in Greensboro, the same house I had grown up in for hours from Charlotte. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon on the Wednesday before because my mother had insisted on a full week of family time, and because Daniel had called twice to make sure I was coming, which was unusual enough to make me cautious. Renee was already there with her husband Marcus. Not my Marcus, her Marcus, a financial planner named Marcus Delacroix who had the handshake of a man perpetually running for office. Their 2 daughters, ages 6 and 8, were running through the house with the specific energy of children who had been promised pie. I loved my nieces uncomplicated, genuinely, in a way that was easy because they asked nothing of me except to be present. That evening the family fell into its familiar rhythms. My father grilled. My mother orchestrated the kitchen from her position at the center of it, directing Renee and me while Daniel sat at the kitchen island and offered commentary. He was 40 years old, a corporate attorney at a mid-sized firm in Greensboro, and he held court the way he always had, confidently, casually, as though the world had arranged itself around his convenience. He asked about my work 3 times that evening, each time with a slightly different edge to the question. Still doing the health tech thing? That software company still going? You still working with hospitals or did that fall through? Each question was designed to confirm what he believed, that I was treading water. That the thing I'd been vague about for years was probably smaller, shakier, less real than I let on. I answered each one with the same mild non-answer I had perfected over years of practice, and each time I did, something behind his eyes went slightly satisfied. I noticed he never checked his phone near me. That was unusual for Daniel. I went to bed that night with a low, specific unease that I couldn't name. Thanksgiving morning was ordinary until it wasn't. My mother had asked everyone to gather in the living room before dinner. That in itself was not strange. She often made announcements at gatherings, coordinated gift exchanges, organized family photos. But when I came downstairs and saw the arrangement, my parents on the sofa, Daniel in the armchair to the left, Renee and her husband on the love seat, and a man I didn't recognize seated near the fireplace with a leather briefcase across his knees, I felt the floor shift very slightly beneath me. The man was in his late 50s, silver-haired. A dark suit that was too formal for a Thanksgiving living room. He had the particular stillness of someone accustomed to rooms where things were about to change. My mother stood. "I want everyone here for this," she said. She used her most composed voice, the one she reserved for things she had rehearsed. Over the past 8 weeks I made a decision. I hired a professional investigator. His name is Raymond Stokes. 30 years in financial investigation, formerly with the FBI. She gestured toward the man near the fireplace. I paid $8,000 for a complete background and financial investigation. Because I love this family and because I believe the truth matters and because for years, I have felt that Nadia has not been honest with us about her life. Renee looked at me startled. Her husband studied his hands. Daniel did not look at me at all. He was looking at my mother with the expression of someone watching a plan execute. My nieces were upstairs. I was grateful for that. I sat down on the remaining chair near the window. I said nothing. I folded my hands in my lap and I waited, and the thing I felt was not fear exactly. It was something quieter and colder and more precise. I recognized this moment. I had spent years wondering if it would come, and now that it had, I found I was almost relieved to finally be in it. Raymond Stokes set his briefcase on the coffee table. He opened it. He removed 2 manila envelopes. Large, sealed, identical except for the handwritten labels on each. He set them side by side. "I want to be clear about how I work," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man who had delivered difficult information in living rooms before. "When a client hires me to conduct a financial and background investigation on a subject, my professional standard requires that I investigate all relevant parties, not only the named subject, but any parties financially or legally connected to the matter. That is what I was hired to do. That is what I did. I have 2 reports." My mother nodded. She was still standing. She looked certain. "First envelope," Stokes said and lifted it. The named subject. Nadia Holloway. He opened it. He removed a document that was, I could see from across the room, at least 40 pages. He set 3 items on the coffee table. The document, a copy of an industry award certificate, and what appeared to be a printed company valuation summary. Nadia Holloway. Age 34. founder and controlling shareholder, 63%, of ClearPath Health Technologies LLC, incorporated in the state of North Carolina. Current independent valuation, $78 million. He paused. Annual recurring revenue for the most recently completed fiscal year, 11.4 million. Employees, 41. Current active contracts with 7 hospital networks across 4 states. He placed a finger on the award certificate. NC Tech Association Emerging Company Award, 2 consecutive years. Southeast Business Journal Top 40 Under 40 current year. No outstanding legal judgments. No debt defaults. No criminal record of any kind. He set the document down. The living room was very quiet. My mother had not moved. But something had gone out of her posture. Some forward-leaning certainty that had been there a moment ago. Daniel was looking at the coffee table. Renee's hand had gone to her mouth. My father, Gerald Holloway, was looking at me. He was looking at me the way I had wanted him to look at me for 15 years, and I had not expected it to feel the way it did. Not triumphant, but something rawer and less comfortable than triumph. Something that had been waiting a very long time and did not know now that the door was open whether it wanted to walk through. I held his gaze. I did not look away. Second envelope, Raymond Stokes said. He picked it up. He turned it slowly in his hands. He looked at my mother. Mrs. Holloway. As I said, my professional standard requires that I investigate all financially connected parties. In the course of investigating your daughter's background, I became aware of a financial relationship between your household and a registered nonprofit organization operating in Guilford County. The Holloway Family Community Foundation. He paused. Registered in 2019. Named board member, Patricia Holloway. He opened the second envelope. Over 19 months, between March of last year and the present, $95,000 was diverted from the nonprofit's operating account through a series of transactions that do not correspond to any documented charitable expenditure, vendor contract, or board-approved disbursement. He set the second document on the table. I don't deliver half-truths, he said simply. That's not how I work. My mother sat down. She sat down the way people sit when their legs make the decision before their mind does. Suddenly. Completely. She sat down on the sofa and she looked at the second envelope, and she did not look like my mother anymore. Not the composed, certain woman who had stood up 60 seconds ago to dismantle me in front of our family. She looked small in a way I had never seen her look, and old and cornered. Daniel said, there has to be an explanation for. The documentation is complete, Stokes said quietly. Transaction records, account statements, and a timeline. He looked at Daniel. I would recommend you and your mother speak with legal counsel before discussing the specifics further. Is this, Renee's voice came out thin. Is this criminal? Diversion of nonprofit funds is a matter of state and federal law, Stokes said. I am not an attorney. What I can tell you is that the documentation in that envelope is comprehensive. My father had not spoken. He was still sitting in the same position he had been in since the meeting began, and the expression on his face was one I had no name for. Not shock exactly, not anger, something that looked like a man watching 2 things he believed about his life revise themselves simultaneously. Daniel stood up. This is ridiculous. Mom, don't say anything else. I'm calling. He pulled out his phone. Sit down, Daniel, my father said. It was quiet. It was completely quiet. Daniel sat down. I had not spoken since I sat down at the beginning of this meeting. I had not cried. I had not smiled. I had watched the room the way I had learned to watch rooms, with attention, with patience, with the particular stillness of someone who has already done the harder work and simply needs to wait for the evidence to speak. Raymond Stokes closed his briefcase. He stood. He handed my father a business card. Both full reports are in their respective envelopes. My contact information is on the card if you have questions. He looked around the room once, with the detached professionalism of a man completing a job he'd agreed to do. I'm sorry this wasn't the outcome you expected, Mrs. Holloway. He walked to the front door, let himself out, and closed it quietly behind him. The family sat in the wreckage of the Thanksgiving living room. My father picked up the first report, my report, and began to read it. What happened in the 30 minutes after Raymond Stokes left is not easy to describe cleanly, because it did not happen cleanly. My mother cried. Not the performative tears she sometimes used in arguments, but something that looked genuinely broken. The tears of someone who had built a narrative carefully for years and watched it collapse in under 4 minutes. She said my name twice, and both times it came out like a question, and both times I found I had nothing to give her. Daniel made 3 phone calls in the backyard. Through the window I could see him pacing, one hand pressed to his forehead, his voice too low to hear. Renee came and sat next to me on the couch. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know about the investigation until last week. Daniel told me it would be, he said it would clear the air." "I know," I said. "I did know." Renee had never been cruel to me. She had been passive in the way that well-meaning people are passive, which is its own kind of wound but a different one. "Nadia's $78 million. Yes. And you never, why didn't you ever?" I turned and looked at my sister. She was 31 years old and had a good life and had always assumed, with the easy confidence of someone who has never been the target, that the family dynamics she observed were minor, manageable, not really as serious as I had sometimes suggested. "Because," I said carefully, "every time I shared something good with this family, it was used to diminish me. So I stopped sharing." She was quiet for a long time. "That's fair," she finally said. And the way she said it, simply without defense, was the first genuinely honest thing I could remember Renee saying to me in years. My father found me in the kitchen an hour later. I was standing at the window with a cup of coffee I wasn't drinking, watching the bare November yard. He stood beside me for a moment without speaking. Gerald Holloway was a retired civil engineer, a man who communicated primarily through silence and proximity, who had loved his children in the particular muted way of men who were raised by other muted men, who had never known how to say the things that needed saying and had spent his life hoping his presence communicated them instead. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. Inadequate by any standard. But he said them as though he meant them. Not as performance, not as a bid for forgiveness, but as simple acknowledgement. "I'm sorry. This happened and I was part of it by not stopping it, and I'm sorry." "I know, Dad," I said. We stood together at the kitchen window for a while. That was all. It was not enough, but it was something, and I was old enough to know the difference between enough and something, and to accept something when it was offered honestly. The weeks that followed moved quickly. My mother retained a criminal defense attorney before the end of that week. The nonprofit matter was serious. $95,000 over 19 months is not a bookkeeping error. It is a pattern, and patterns have legal consequences. I did not involve myself in that process. I had my own attorney. Marcus Webb had put me in touch with our company's outside counsel, and I made clear that I had no information beyond what was in the report and no interest in either accelerating or obstructing whatever process followed. Daniel called me 6 days after Thanksgiving. He wanted to talk about the nonprofit situation. Specifically, he wanted to know whether I had had any advance knowledge of the investigation's scope, whether I had in some way set this up. "Daniel," I said, "your mother hired the investigator. Her name is on the check." He was quiet. "I didn't know he was coming," I said. "I didn't know what he'd find. I sat in that room the same as you." I don't know whether he believed me. It didn't matter particularly. What mattered more was the call I received from the Southeast Business Journal 2 weeks later. Someone at the Thanksgiving gathering, I have a strong suspicion it was Renee's husband, Marcus Delacroix, who ran in the kinds of professional circles where this sort of thing traveled, had mentioned the story. A journalist reached out wanting to do a profile. The angle she pitched was the one I would have chosen myself if I'd been pitching it. A founder who built a $78 million company while keeping it completely private from her own family, and what that says about the relationship between entrepreneurship and the families that fail to see us. I gave the interview. It ran in January. The photograph they used was one taken in our Charlotte office. Me at my desk, the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, looking exactly like what I was. A person who had done the work for years in the quiet and was comfortable in the result. Marcus Webb framed it and hung it in the conference room without asking. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning before a client call and stood looking at it for a moment before I smiled and sat down. My mother's legal situation resolved, eventually, in the way these things often do when the documentation is thorough and the attorney is competent and the subject has no prior record and expresses genuine remorse. He did not go to prison. She entered into a restitution agreement, repaid the full $95,000 and resigned from the foundation's board. The foundation itself was restructured under new oversight. I do not know exactly what she felt during that period. She called me twice, once to apologize, once to explain. I listened to the apology. I did not pick up for the explanation. There is a difference between accountability and narrative management, and I have learned to recognize which one is being offered. My father and I began talking more regularly after Thanksgiving. Not about the big things, not at first. About work, about the engineering projects he still consulted on part-time in retirement, about the book he was reading, about my nieces. The small architecture of a relationship being quietly rebuilt from its usable pieces. It is not what I had wanted when I was younger. When I was younger, I had wanted to be seen fully and loved loudly and claimed without conditions. I understand now that some of that is not possible, and that the grief of that impossibility is its own real thing that doesn't go away just because you've made peace with it. Sasha came to Charlotte for New Year's. We cooked in my apartment and drank good wine, and she made me tell her the entire Thanksgiving story in real time, start to finish, every detail, and at the end of it she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "He really brought 2 envelopes. He really brought 2 envelopes, I confirmed. She started laughing and I started laughing, and we laughed the way you laugh when something has been too heavy for too long and the weight has finally shifted enough to let air in. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "Keep building," I said. ClearPath has 3 new hospital contracts pending. Marcus thinks we'll cross 15 million AR by Q3. I have a board meeting in February. "With your family?" "With my company's board." I paused. "The other board is still figuring out what it is." Sasha nodded. He understood. She had her own complicated family in Lagos, her own versions of the same distances. "You know what I think the hardest part is?" she said. "What?" "Being right doesn't feel the way you thought it would. It feels lonelier." I thought about my father at the kitchen window. I thought about Renee saying that's fair. I thought about Daniel's voice on the phone, still looking for a version of the story where he came out clean. "Yeah," I said. "It does." But I was still here. I had built something real and it had survived being seen, and the people who needed to be accountable were being accountable, and the people worth keeping were still in my life. Marcus Webb was in the next office. Sasha was across the kitchen table. My nieces had sent me a video that morning of a dance they'd made up, 45 seconds of pure uncomplicated joy. That was not nothing. In February, I flew to Chicago for the Hospital Network Conference, the largest healthcare technology event on the East Coast. On the second day during the networking lunch, I ran into the CEO of a competing firm I'd been tracking for 2 years. He extended his hand and said, "Nadia Holloway. I've been wanting to meet you. Your company is everywhere right now." I shook his hand. I smiled, not the polite, restrained smile I had spent years giving my family, but the real one. The one that knew exactly where it had come from and what it had cost to get here. "Yes," I said. "It is. Some victories don't arrive with fanfare. They arrive on a Thursday afternoon in a living room in Greensboro, in front of people who spent years deciding who you were, and they arrive quietly, carried in 2 manila envelopes by a man in a dark suit who simply did his job. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't orchestrated it. I had simply built something real for years in the silence they gave me, and when the light finally came on, it illuminated everything in the room. Not just me. That is the thing about truth. It doesn't choose sides. It doesn't perform. It doesn't arrive when you need it most or spare the people who should be spared. It just arrives. And it shows you exactly what was always there.